Now, one of these days, you guys are crashing at the little studio, and Jim tells me you're woken up by the sound of a car doing laps around the house. Do you recall?
No, I didn't.
Well, Jim says he goes and opens up the door, and out pops Vince Matthews and Michelle Silverstein. I guess that was his way of waking you guys up. That's what he tells me. Is he did a couple laps around the house and then pulled up in front. And so Shell was in town, and he wanted to buy a guitar. And Vince said, "Well, I know the guy Bob McDill's got a Martin D28."
No, it was a Gibson.
Was it? Okay.
And I sold it to Shell at a discount price. Jim and I had a big feast that night.
Had you already, the way Jim told you had already taken it to the pawn shop.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And then Shell said, "Well, take me there."
Yeah.
And so he paid to get it out of Hawk, and then gave you he would travel with a wad of $100 bills in his pocket. He'd peel them off to,
Right.
Anybody he felt needed a little pick me up.
He was a character too.
Yeah.
The world of characters back then. Vince Matthews, an unforgettable character. That was Jim's buddy.
I read somewhere that you hadn't really come around to writing country songs until you were riding in the back of Vince Matthews' Cadillac and you heard George Jones' "A Good Year for the Roses."
Didn't know how to write those ballads, but I had an epiphany when I heard that whatever it was in that grit, pain, something.
Yeah.
I could never have written "Don't Close Your Eyes," for example, if I hadn't had that moment of understanding.
Alan and me, Jack got Alan and me to move from Memphis to Nashville, and we got McDill up here, and we said, you can come up here and you love it up here, and Bob said, I can't write country songs. That was the big thing, but and we finally got him up here, and in my estimation,
He figured
ended
it
up
out.
being one of the best country songwriters that ever came out of Nashville.
As Red Fox so famously said, a man's got to eat. And he said, then Red Fox said, sometime he got them little old children, they want to eat too.
What were you doing in the early 70s, Alan?
In the early 70s? Well, I moved here in 1970, commuted for about 6 months, and then I was like we all were. I was up here trying to write songs and get recorded. And McDill and I wrote a lot together. Dickey and I wrote a lot together, and we. At some point, Jack Clement decided to start his own record label, and he wanted me to run it. I don't know why, but one of the first things I did was ask Bob to make an album for the label. And as he was getting ready to do that, he and I wrote a bunch of songs together, one of which was a song called Catfish John, and that got recorded. I don't know if it was before they finished your album or afterwards. I think it was after.
I don't remember.
Anyway, it became a hit. And
Johnny Russell?
that was Bob's and my first hit song in Nashville.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more, I guess you'd describe it more as folksy than country, but it was a big country hit. And I had the impression that that's part of what helped Bob get over the uncertainty about whether this was the right town for him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
And,
What's your introduction to Don Williams? What's your introduction to Don Williams?
I was, when this label started, one of the things I wanted to do was find Susan Taylor, who was a member of the Pozo Seco Singers. I still remember where I was when I heard a record called Time, and Susan was singing the lead on that. And that was Don Williams and Susan Taylor and one other guy. And I just loved her voice. And she and Don had ended up in Nashville, and we met them when they were doing their last album together. A guy named Tony Moon was producing it, and we went by to pitch a couple of songs and pitched them a Bob McDill song, which they recorded for that project. But the project was for an independent label that didn't last long, and Don, so we met them that day, but Don, when that project didn't fly, Don left town, went back to Texas and went into the furniture business with his father-in-law, and I finally persuaded Susan to do an album for JMI Records, Jack's record label, with me producing it. And somewhere along the way, as we were working on that album, she mentioned that she'd heard from Donnie, as she called him, and he was very unhappy in Texas in the furniture business and wanted to come to town and see if there was anything for him here. And she wanted us to meet. She thought we'd like each other. So I said, okay. And when he came to town, we had dinner and we liked each other. And he was saying he thought he would move back here, but he was talking like 6 months out. And I said, well, if you do that, get in touch with me. We'll see if we can work something out. So when it was like a month later, he calls me and he's here with his family and everything he owns in a U-Haul truck. And so I put him to work in the publishing company with where Bob was writing and Dickey and I both were. And for the next 6 months or so, I told him to do that, and later we would record him. And so that went on for 6 months or so. And then we finally, he said, well, when are we going to record me? And I said, well, I guess right now. So we started on an album for him. And while we were doing that, I walked into the publishing company one day. Nobody else was there but Don. He was sitting at a big long table with a guitar and a lead sheet in front of him, and he was singing Amanda. And I stopped and listened. And when he finished, I said, who wrote that? He said, McDill. I said, why haven't I heard it? He said, oh, you know, McDill, he didn't think anybody would like it that much. So we ended up recording that on Don's very first album. And when Jack Clement heard that recording, he wrote a review on the tablet that said, Amanda, exactly as good as Shakespeare. Signed, Jack H. Clement. And so that's, anyway, by that time I had diverted a lot of my energy into the record label, which lasted about 2 years, and then it folded. But it was a great time, great fun label, and kind of got all three of us rolling here in Nashville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dickey, early 70s, you kind of got away from the production a little bit and started focusing more on being an artist?
Pretty much, I guess. I signed with RCA. We did a session on me at Jack's studio, and Danny Davis signed me to RCA, and just started recording. And you know, Alan and Jack and me, they produced my first few records, and so I was gone a lot of that time because I got really lucky and had a few hit records to start off, and I was always out of town, but that kind of got me going as far as my country career with RCA.
Okay.
Mhm.
You remember any memories of writing songs with Jim? I know Bob and Dickey. I know you guys. Did you ever write anything?
We wrote a couple of things together. I remember one we wrote called "Coming Up the Hard Way." It never went anywhere, but it was a neat song.
Mhm.
I always felt like Jim had more talent than he realized. But so I don't know if he ever really pursued writing that hard or not. But
Well, what he told me was his kind of intention when he moved here was like he was going to be a producer. And then like kind of when he got here, just falling in with you guys, and he had done writing. He had written, I know some of the B-sides of the Smoke Ring. He had done some of those, so he knew he could write a little bit. But I think it was getting here and getting around some other guys. I think he figured, well, maybe these guys they seem to think I have something. They it's not that I'm just funny. They must like I must have some sort of talent. I think
Yeah,
So I think
we wrote a few songs together.
Yeah.
And we wrote one song, Nothing Ever Happened to It. I remember the title, Did He Leave You the Way He Found You? And I love that song, and I don't know why nothing ever happened, but we wrote one song called Field of Dreams that Charlie Pride recorded.
that's a great one. Yeah,
And,
I know that one. There's the only I guess two that I can think of, Bob, that you guys wrote, where you co-wrote with Jim and Vince, Mr. Soul, that came out on the Kinks of Spring Suite. And there's another one that Matt has a couple different versions. He has a real done studio version, then like a more of a demo version of Lend a Hand. You remember that one? That one, it has such a, the first thing I thought was like Crosby, Stills and Nash kind of thing is what that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Jim was a co-writer on that, was he not?
Yeah. Yeah.
He was a good player too. That's him playing that acoustic riff all the way through. That's with the whole song's built around that riff, and that was Jim playing on that session.
He said at some point Jack Clement was going to New York, I think, to produce a Louis Armstrong album.
Yeah.
It's like 1970, probably.
yeah, probably in the 70s.
And he said, he moved here like June of 70, I believe. And so it was like later in the year. So he had just come out of the Smoke Ring, which he had kind of primarily been playing horn. That's what he told me. He said, Cowboy come to me and said, hey, I'm going to New York to produce this Louis Armstrong album. Why don't you come with and play guitar? I'm like, no, I can't do that. And so he didn't do it.
Wow.
And that's, he said that's one of those very few things of like, I wish I would have done that, because to have somebody like Jack Clement say to you, come with me and play guitar, that means you can do it. It's, it's really an affirmation of like, you got something going.
Yeah. Yeah, Cowboy, he wouldn't coddle you. He would tell it straight. And especially playing guitar. If you didn't keep good rhythm and all of that, he'd move you on out of the circle.